Well, thank you all for joining us for this important dialogue today, and what a day it's been. Our day began with a conversation about memes, maps, and Modi. It continued with empathetic words from a professor from Jefferson's University, a passionate talk about the interplay of Islamophobia and ignorance, and the often under-acknowledged role of race, and a discussion of representation, misrepresentation, and the absence of representation. We continue with an examination of the memes that are toxic, memes that are maim, and memes that displace the truth and undermine nuance. And in our most recent panel, we heard about the murder of innocent American dogs. To help tie some of these larger themes together, we'd like to ask Michael Murray to join us on stage. Following Michael's talk, we would like to ask all today's panelists to join us here as well to engage with questions from the audience. Now, though, let's welcome Michael. He was named president of the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation earlier this year, and he leads the foundations in their mission of fostering a healthy democracy, primarily through grants to colleges, universities, hospitals, medical schools, and divinity schools. The foundations focus on 5 key areas: private higher education, public educational media, interfaith leadership and religious literacy, environmental engagement, stewardship and solutions, and palliative care. All important and vital areas of emphasis. Let's welcome Michael Murray, please.
Well, thank you, and it's been a pleasure to be here with all of you, and it's been a stimulating conversation. I appreciate having the opportunity to be part of it, and I don't know if the Ansaris have already left, but just want to say thanks to them for making this all possible. When Scott and Mahan asked me to do this, they asked me to pick up on a few of the threads from the day and that captured my attention, and say a few words about that, and also say something about the role of the philanthropic sector in this conversation. So I've been making some modifications to the comments I wanted to make during the day. I have no idea how long they are, but they're not going to be longer than 12 minutes. So we'll see what we get through. Working at a foundation that accepts open calls for funding requests from anyone with a web browser can be a really interesting experience. And sometimes you get some pretty strange requests. So prior to coming to the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, I was at the John Templeton Foundation for a decade. And while we were there, we received a request in one round for $3.1 billion. And that was the exact amount of the endowment. And this person told us that they wanted all the money because they hated us and they wanted us to go out of business. We didn't fund that one. We got another one from someone who wanted to investigate the question of whether or not we survive our bodily death. And that's actually not a surprising request to get at the Templeton Foundation. But when the program associates started doing some research into the person who had made the application, he found out, sadly, that the person had passed away. And that funding request was submitted the day after he passed away. That is, I'm not making this up. So I guess maybe he didn't need to have the money after all. He knew the answer. At Arthur Vining Davis, we support institutions of higher ed, and we received a request from an elite liberal arts college this fall, one that you would all know if I told you the name, which I won't, to develop and implement a required course for every student at the college on a particular topic. And you might wonder what that topic was. I might ask you to guess, but you probably think it's religion, given the theme of our conference, but that wasn't it. It was on quantum optics, a required course for all students on quantum optics. And you might wonder why. And the answer seemed to be because they thought students were ignorant about quantum mechanics. And I'm sure that's true. They probably are ignorant about quantum mechanics, and most people are probably ignorant about quantum mechanics and quantum optics in particular. Most people have probably never even heard of it. Now, we didn't fund that request, and the reason is because quantum optics illiteracy doesn't matter. I mean, look, some people should be knowledgeable about quantum optics. It's an important topic for someone to know something about. But if the majority of the population flunks the quantum optics literacy test, like, that's okay. I don't think that's a problem. And some people think about religion in the same way. That is, they think religion is dying or noxious or impotent or something, but ignorance about it does no harm. I think that's probably not true of most people in this room, but it's true of a lot of people. And that's just wrong. Religious ignorance is a problem, But what sort of problem it is and how to fix it, that's another matter, and that's probably something you've heard just from the comments you've heard from our panelists today. Most of you probably have seen, and it's been referenced here, the Pew Research Center Religious Literacy Report that was published a couple months ago. If you haven't seen it, let me summarize the results in the words of our esteemed colleague and expert on religious literacy, Stephen Prothero. We flunked. Of the 32 questions, Americans got an average 14.2 right, and so we scored 44% on the religious literacy tests. Not something we should be proud of. One might think that the Pew survey isn't so much about religious literacy, really. It's more about religious trivia. It's like trivia questions. That might be right. It might be just that it's about religious trivia. Maybe we shouldn't worry about that too much. Probably as or more important than that, what Todd earlier called religion 101 knowledge is the knowledge of other religions that we acquire from relationships with those from other traditions. And how we score on that is something we probably need to learn more about. But one of the things that was interesting from the Pew report was not just what it showed about our levels of religious literacy, but the implications of that illiteracy. This has been discussed a little bit here as well. In addition to measuring literacy, they looked at the level of positive or negative sentiment that individuals have towards others from other traditions using a technique called the feeling thermometer. If you've read the report, you know how this works, and this is a tool they've used in other reports as well. So with the tool, they asked respondents to say how they feel about those from other religious traditions using a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is cool and negative and 100 is warm and positive. And one bit of bad news that came out of the report, I think, is that whether you're in the high or low religious literacy condition, sentiment towards Mormons and Muslims is the lowest. That's unfortunate. But on a positive note, high religious literacy leads to higher positive sentiment towards religious groups in a way that's statistically significant, with one exception, which again, if you've seen the report, you know, and that's evangelicals. Evangelicals suffer a double-digit decrease in sentiment amongst those who demonstrate high religious literacy, which is an interesting subject for discussion. But it seems to show that religious literacy at least correlates with positive sentiment, which in turn lubricates the social friction between religious groups. And in light of the friction that we see between religious groups, that's an important result. And while data might be hard to interpret, as Todd pointed out earlier, there's some reasons why we might worry about how to actually understand that. There's a report, or a series of reports, that's about to come out from the Interfaith Youth Corps in Chicago. They funded a $6.5 million longitudinal study on college campuses that was looking at a similar set of issues. And I think one thing you're going to see from that is that it's not just a correlation, that actually increased religious literacy does also increase positive sentiment in a way that we should pay close attention to. But we also know that religious ignorance is bad for other reasons, not just because the lack of it increases social friction. Another Pew report that's been referenced by folks in the audience, or in the panels, just yesterday, reinforced something that, again, we all likely know. A lot of social science research just tells you stuff you already know. It just gives you data to back it up. And that is that religious disaffiliation continues to rise at a rapid rate over the last decade, from 2009 to 2019. Those who describe themselves as disaffiliated has gone up from 17% to 26%. But as many of you also probably know, only 9 of those 26 percentage points represent individuals who are atheists or agnostics. So the rest of those, 91% of Americans, regard themselves as having some kind of spiritual orientation or other. And from other surveys, we know that 3/4 of Americans believe that religion provides an essential guide to understanding purpose in life and the nature of right and wrong. So America remains a pretty highly religious or spiritual country. And it's also a country that claims, at least, whether this is true is another matter, to see religion as an important source of behavioral motivation. So if we want to understand what people are doing and why they do it, and how to channel or harness that behavior, we have to understand the drivers of it. So we have to understand how, and perhaps how to harness or channel religion. That leads to the more difficult question: where do Americans get their understanding of religion? So yesterday in a smaller meeting, Jolyon mentioned that younger audiences, at least in the UK, and I'm sure this is true in the US as well, don't derive their understanding from mainstream journalism, from print or newspaper or television. And in the US, and at any rate, they don't get it through K through 12 education either. which essentially ignores the topic, or, as we just heard, perhaps maybe files lawsuits when the topic is even raised, despite the fact that many times the Supreme Court has affirmed that discussing religious topics in public schools is not illegal or unconstitutional. While that's probably a bad thing, it doesn't look like anybody has the will to do much about it. So it's probably not a way that we're going to change the conversation about religion. I wish that were wrong, but I think it's probably right. So where does our meager knowledge of religion come from? We've heard a lot of people say over the course of the day that it comes from social media. But that doesn't tell us about the ultimate ideology. Where do those who are talking about these things on social media get their ideas from? What are the headwaters that inform what's happening in these social networks? That's another important question that I think we haven't really plumbed yet. Let me just tell you one other brief thing. One other thing that didn't come up that I think is really interesting is some recent research that's come out about something that's called the illusory truth effect. If you don't know what it is and you want to see more about it, I'd encourage you to Google the phrase. And what the illusory truth effect has demonstrated is that when someone hears something repeated more than once, they tend to regard it as more true, even if it's something that they believe is false. And so there's a worry about the noxious effect of social media, because as we continue to hear the same thing over and over again, as it comes to our feed over and over again, even if it's something that when somebody asks me if it's true, I say that it's not, it has the increasing ring of truth as I hear it more times, which is a worrisome feature of the way social media functions. Anyway, so we might acknowledge that religious literacy is a good thing for us, but if there's no demand for the product, right, we might say, well, religious literacy is important, but if nobody wants it, well, then creating supply is fruitless. So as we think about what we're doing in the philanthropic sector, right, should we be supporting an increase in the supply of whatever it is it needs that people would have to have in order to become religiously literate? Well, it depends. Is there a demand or not? And you might think the answer is no, but you might think the answer is yes. And you might think the answer is yes because of things like Krista Tippett's radio program and podcast that gets 50 million downloads a year. Now, it's not exclusively about religion, right? But a lot of what Krista Tippett covers is religious topics, and people are engaging her content because they're interested in that content. Or that Morgan Freeman's Story of God series that appeared on National Geographic was the most popular television show ever broadcast on National Geographic. These are indications that there is, in fact, an appetite for this. So there is demand, the product is good for us, but the supply chain is weak. And for those of us in philanthropy, that looks like an opportunity. So a couple weeks ago, I and another foundation convened the funders who are most interested in doing work on religious literacy and interfaith engagement. Collectively, these foundations have over $25 billion in assets. And we surveyed them before coming to this meeting, and we asked them, what do you think the problems are? These are the foundations that participated. I'll just run through this part very quickly. I think hopefully you'll find it of interest to see what are the funders attending to? What do they think the problems are? What do they think the solutions are? And you can tell us where we're wrong. So the problems they identified are these 6. Religious illiteracy, especially amongst leaders, lack of interreligious collaboration on issues of common concern, religious individuals and communities decreasing in respect for individuals and communities of other traditions, increasingly negative perception of religion generally, and especially among non-religious audiences, lack of serious discussion in colleges and universities about religion and its role, and minimal intellectual resource sharing among traditions. Those are the 6 things that they picked out as the most important issues from as far as they were concerned. And they thought that those 6 problems lead to these 6 ills: social disharmony between and towards religious groups, broken democratic processes where disagreement can't be tolerated or adjudicated, social problems which leave social capital untapped, misguided international policy, misunderstanding of religions and religious people amongst current and future leaders, and more superficial understanding of spiritual or religious realities. And finally, we asked them to identify what are the outcomes that you're pursuing to address these. And they gave us these 5. Improve religious knowledge, especially about matters of key civic importance and amongst key audiences. Increase awareness in the general public of the beneficial aspects of religion. Improve the respect that religious individuals and communities have towards individuals and communities of other religious traditions. Create opportunities for meaningful social action amongst religious groups. And create opportunities for meaningful scholarly research among scholars from diverse religious traditions. The big funders who are operating in this space, that's the sort of thing they're interested in. If you're interested in those things, go find those people or come talk to me. So we at Arthur Binding Davis are really focusing on three things. Number one, supporting the production of new media that's related to religious literacy. We think that YouTube, for example, and podcasts are one source of the headwaters for social media, and we'd like to see more production in that space. We think that creating greater opportunities to improve religious literacy on college campuses is important. Students are looking for that content, and it's an informative period of their life for those who are going on to positions of cultural leadership. And finally, we're looking to support some of the work that's going on in advancing religious journalism. Some of you probably know the Lilly Endowment gave a very large grant to Religion News Foundation, AP in the conversation. We cannot match the contribution that Lilly made, but some other funders are coming around that to try to support advancement of local religious reporting and to provide opportunities for journalists to learn more about what's happening in the religion space, and we hope to be able to help in that regard. All right, I think my time is up, and so I'm going to stop. Thanks for your time, and really enjoyed the conversation with all of you.
So now we'd like to invite all of our panelists up today. So please come up and join us, and we'll take questions from the audience. Don't be shy. Be careful of the rolling chairs in the middle. No.
We have enough chairs, Steve. Don't fall off the edge. Oh, sure. Tarek.
Oh, let's do that. Let's open it.
Just don't roll back, Ibrahim. You're off the edge. I always roll back.
There we go.
Okay.
Here, what is it? Oh, that's much better.
Solian, be careful. Don't fall off. That's a rolling chair. It's exciting. It's more exciting.
Thank you, panelists, for your creativity and patience. We appreciate it. Just throw it open, just generally. Any reactions to Michael's comments? Any thoughts? Anything come to mind from takeaways from what he said? Anyone?
I'll just jump in on the last thing he said, which was about, just from the perspective I'm coming at, which is obviously new media and social media and religious literacy, religious journalism. I think that's absolutely key. As a non-journalist, just as a member of a faith community, I know there's discussions that are being had all the time about how do you engage young people, how do you engage new people, how do you engage people from outside the community, and obviously all roads lead back to some form of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube native video, which none of us really understand, and Mark Zuckerberg doesn't really want us to understand. But I think that is vitally important. We talked about complexity in our panel and importance of depth, but of course you also have to be able to do complexity with brevity in just a reality of life. And therefore, for example, when you see in my company, AJ Plus doing what they do very well in terms of kind of digesting stories online, I think that's quite important. It's an important skill to have and be able to, I think people from the foundational space, from the think tank space, from the university space should be investing in that. Otherwise, you just leave it all for Prager University.
Yeah, may I add to that?
If I just could ask a question to Heidi and Stephen, who study these things, digital media and stuff. I'm also curious, are there any studies, especially about digital media and religion, right? And what can I do? And Michael, where's Michael? They're the back. I mean, you also look at these issues carefully, so I would like to hear what kind of guidance should we receive on that.
Well, there's a lot of research that looks at kind of just general social media use, how religious institutions kind of negotiate and use technologies. We find that a lot of people are using social media to kind of talk about a lot of topics, and religion is one of them. But I think one of the challenges is that oftentimes, whether it's in the academics or even religious organizations, we're not very schooled at kind of what the best strategies are. And we kind of try everything. I think some religious organizations in the last 5 to 7 years are becoming more savvy. They're hiring social media officers, they're hiring webmasters. And they're empowering them to do kind of really interesting work. But the problem is that this creates challenges for those communities and institutions because they often have more kind of a bigger digital footprint and more influence as far as in their voice than actually the official sources. And I think kind of the tension also in academia is that, again, we aren't taught how to kind of develop our kind of digital footprints as well. So I think that a lot of the things that religious organizations and academics are struggling with are kind of part of that kind of thing. And I think, we just have to be willing to get out there. The challenges for religious communities and academics is that, we don't like losing control of our message. But the minute you put anything, open your mouth in a social media era, you lose control of it. And we have to be willing to give up that control and learn how to wrangle it rather than control it, our message.
Yeah, I just actually wanted to add to something that Mehdi said and take issue with you, Ibrahim. We took as gospel your point that the memes are simplistic, they promote stereotypes, and the reality is much more complex. But I'm triggered by something that Stephen said, and I think Tom Gallagher also made a point about how academics need to précis things for journalists. I think the reality is that attention spans are dropping. And so therefore, we might have to go the other way. We might have to find ways to communicate complex ideas in memes. Maybe our next conference should be about creating better memes. No, on a serious note, young people don't want voluminous things. They're consuming the memes. So is it our responsibility to find ways to communicate with brevity, things that are complex?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this issue because I tweet, I'm on Facebook, I have a website that is being redone now because I want to become active there again. And I do realize the need for brevity and attention span. So when I was saying that, so one can unpack a prejudicial meme in simple ways, and that's a skill, that's a communication skill that we need to learn and acquire. So I'm struggling through those issues. I don't deny that's a reality out there. And my colleagues know I've been saying that we at the Keough School of Global Affairs should be having specialists who study, because our school is a school that's dedicated to human development and human dignity and taking religion seriously. We need to study how religion is received and how people internalize religion through the new media, because I don't think it's the same as sitting in a mosque and sitting in the pews or attending a gurdwara or a temple. It's a different mode. I mean, for instance, people read the Quran now on their phones. A big question comes, do they have proper ablution, right? They can just read it, okay? You take that, okay, you take it to the bathroom with you, right? I mean, that's another kind of sacrilege. Most people who are Muslim understand what I'm saying. But it's no longer the Quran. It's a digital fragmented thing, right? So it's a new kind of ontology. It's a new kind of being, new kind of reality, as they say. So, but the consumption of that on the train in London, on the bus in New Delhi, and everywhere, people are internalizing that. They quickly get the message from their sheikh, right? Or from their priest, and so on, and they're on top of the message. And they take positions in the workplace, in debate. So I think these are realities that I don't know what the reception of that is. But I know my kids use it, I know friends who use it, but I don't have the map of that. I don't have the geography of that.
I just want to add that this point that was mentioned a couple times in the course of the day about Sheikh Google is something that I heard from multiple religious actors in contexts that I've been doing some research on religion, violence, and peace-building practices. So I heard it in Mindanao, in the Philippines, and in Kenya, where many people who have some sort of a traditional authority are explicitly talking about losing it to Sheikh Google. So it's something that was a phrase that was very ubiquitous in those contexts. And then the approach to combat it is through this concept of counter-messaging. That, the counter-message in that context that securitizes religion, in particular the religion that is securitized is a marked religion, like Mahdi talked about, is that it needs to be so brief, the message, the counter-message, and compelling, and communicated through social media. And so the youth is targeted very intentionally because they are social influencers. So this language is being deployed, and then they come up with this counter-message about the good religion, and all together, and it all happens under the within the framework of religious literacy, increasing religious literacy, but in fact the counter-message is quite simplistic, but it's brief. It's communicated in a few characters, or I think it's something that I personally emerged from this particular research very worried about kind of the depth and the texture of religious traditions and what happened.
I don't need a mic, but I'll simply say, just to build on that, I think we all agree today, although Tariq's question raises doubt about memes, that we have to deal with social media and memes, etc., but we don't need to accept the ethos of it. At least I don't want to. I take Steve's very good counsel about our job as academics, as scholars, as communicators, is to make information accessible, to get it right, to engage. Otherwise we're talking to ourselves. I get that. But the world is complex. And I think many of us have studied a long time and continue to try to learn more about that complexity. And if we give in to, be dictated to, by a culture that is not a know-nothing culture, but a lot of it sounds like potential fake news to me. And we rail against fake news, but this is complicated stuff. And to say a meme is going to do it in and of itself, or we begin to think that is our job better memes? Maybe, but our job is to, and I think we're in agreement about this, I hope so, is to have the memes be the introductory note to a much deeper conversation. And so the challenge becomes, how do you use the meme to invite a deeper, more engaged conversation, rather than, here we go, boom, bada, boom, we're on to the next thing, and forget about any kind of depth or nuance. We replicate the challenges we often abhor in the political culture if we do that. What I've heard today is we all kind of fundamentally agree with that, except Tari.
Just raising it up. No, but
Can I
I think your
just-
point about
I
I think your point about it being a gateway is an interesting one.
About what?
It being a gateway. A meme can be a gateway, much like a crucifix is, or a Star of David is, right? It's a symbol of something that has lots behind it. It represents it, but it's an invitation to know more, to enter.
Yes.
So I just want to add to what you said, Scott. I mean, it's very striking to me. It's because I'm kind of a quasi journalist and a quasi academic and a quasi everything. Whenever I go and I speak to journalism students, I mean, I have exactly the opposite, which everybody's like, I mean, of course, it's totally useless advice, and I'm absolutely on the losing side of everything. See, the first thing you should do is stay off social media. I mean, to me, it's completely insane. I don't know how anybody has even a 3-second attention span left after they spend all day. I mean, and I look at Twitter too, obviously, because, I mean, whatever, in producing the news, I have to look, da-da-da. But I don't know, to me, it's like you have to have some sense of slowness. I mean, things take time to understand and to, I also work in daily news. Obviously, there's a lot one needs to assimilate very quickly, and that's all fine. But I don't think, it's like, do you think an audience is given or produced? If you think an audience is produced, you owe them more than to just show them whatever, an image or 4 words and tell them, okay, now you know everything. No, I mean, there's a certain amount of, I understand that there's nothing in the world that encourages this now, but a little bit of, quiet, reflection, silence, thought, reading a book. Yeah, it's like you can't even get people to read an article. I don't remember who, the CNN person said 8 minutes on an article, right? Which is absolutely, that's like practically, 4 centuries, right? In the time span. So, I mean, but there has to be something in the middle, right? I mean, the middle 4 centuries and 8 minutes.
It's funny because if you read Axios, which is the DC political organization that's set up specifically with the motto of smart brevity, they will give you the amount of time it takes to read their articles at the top. So this is 6 minutes. Which for me, it's kind of good. I'm like, okay, I can actually do this before the next meeting. One thing I'd say, come back to Scott, is a point of confusing message with messenger. So I think you're right to talk about a beginning and a gateway. And for me, for example, social media, for my journalism, yeah, it's okay. I enjoy and I'm addicted to Twitter. That's a separate discussion I probably need to have with a psychologist. But professionally, it plays a massive role, or at least this is what I tell my wife, to get people to read my stuff or watch my shows. I just wouldn't have the same audiences that I have globally and domestically if I didn't have Twitter or Facebook driving people to the latest show or to the latest debate or whatever it is. And I think that's where it comes back to religion, and especially for you guys in the academic space, which comes back to your point about executive summaries and just building on the idea of accessibility to the work that's produced. As someone who enjoys a good report, because I'm a nerd, I enjoy that as much as I enjoy a good tweet, it amazes me when I come across really interesting reports, and I'm like, nobody knows this exists.
Right.
Like, unless I write about it or link to it, nobody knows it exists. And you can blame multiple actors for that, and we can all share the blame in different ways. But ultimately, you're only responsible for yourself. So for those of you who are running academic departments, universities, what are you going to do to make sure that this great report you've done is not just talking to yourself? And therefore, then you do get into the world of memes and viral videos and YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, because how else are you going to get those audiences? And I think that is quite important, especially if you leave, nature abhors a vacuum. If you leave that space, I mean, look at YouTube, just from a political perspective. YouTube is now basically owned by the alt-right, who have basically monopolized that space while everyone else was looking at Facebook. The Paul Joseph Watsons and Alex Joneses and InfoWars of the world basically now get millions of hits on their crazy conspiratorial videos. And I think that's quite important to look at and see, well, how do they do that from a standing start? And just one other point I'd make about driving people to audiences, Daniel will probably back me up with better data because I don't have the data, but when I used to work at the HuffPost, where everyone obsessed with metrics, one of the interesting things was that actually the longer pieces didn't get lesser audiences if they were topical or if they grabbed the kind of cultural zeitgeist. And if you look at things like The Atlantic right now or the New York Times, I mean, they're having like a renaissance. They're having huge increases in subscriptions. That's because people are reading long stories. But here's what's interesting. I would argue a lot of those long stories are now being accessed because people are able to share them on social media in a way you probably couldn't 10, 20, 30 years ago. We had to buy a subscription to The Atlantic, sit down and read the whole thing. Now you can actually, okay, I'm going to share this 10,000 word piece, and they do get the longer dwell times, to take Daniel's metric. So I think it's not all doom and gloom on that front in terms of social media. I think there is some positivism.
I think one of the challenges, this is to pick up on what you said, is that when we think about how do we respond to digital media, the two kind of responses advocated is either A, we need to kind of just embrace it, this is where people are, this is where the messages are, let's just go and experiment and just try it out. Or it's like, oh, we just need to slow down, we just need to stay off of social media. And the reality is that Generation Z and millennials, this is where they're having the conversations, and they are communicating and they're creating these memes, and this is how they understand and see the world. So we have to kind of live in this kind of tension of that, creating those spaces and using them as conversation. Because memes work because there is an ounce of truth. That's why stereotypes also work. There's something we're familiar, but then there's also these levels of intertextuality that we've talked about, that there's messages, they may be picking up on the humor or on the celebrity character, but there's layers of meaning in there that can be problematic or can actually kind of challenge their thinking. And I actually use memes a lot in my classes. You're probably not surprised, but like 3 of those memes up there were created by my graduate students to basically summarize the arguments of the papers that they had written a couple semesters ago. And so they were, they used the meme to kind of capture the essence, and then they unpack that throughout the paper. And I think that's what we need to do, is that we need to be literate in digital culture as well as to the level we have religious literacy, and be able to kind of be proactive in helping our students interpret a lot of things that they don't understand, both on the religious side as well as in digital culture.
I do want to push back a little more, Scott, so maybe there's 2 of us against you. I think my use of the language of complexity and simplicity might not have been the most felicitous, but I do think that it's really important, apropos of this idea of the executive summary, for us as academics to be able to compress, to be able to abstract. I think that our ecosystem is one where we get, in terms of this question of do we create audiences and do we get them? I mean, we have captive audiences in our classrooms, right? If they don't show up, we can give them a bad grade for class participation. So we're not getting instant feedback except for rolling eyes and at the end of semesters about professors who just can't make a point. And frankly, there are a lot of professors who just can't make a point. And I don't think that brevity is necessarily hostile to complexity. E equals MC squared is one of the great, most complicated things that any human being ever said. And it's in 4 characters, or 3.5, however you but, so why can't we do that? What's wrong with that? And I just think that there aren't enough pushes and mechanisms inside academic culture to just sort of grab people and say, will you please say something? Will you please just say something? And students feel this. Students are frustrated with a lot of their professors, that they just kind of get up and just go on and on and on, and what's the point? And I think those of us who do academic work, we have these points. We have things to make, but we aren't really trained or compelled to compress in the way that, if Dan has a story and he has 500 words for his story, he has 1,200 words for his story. He does not have 1,205. It's not a negotiable thing. And that's a useful thing for academics to be pressed into, and we're hardly ever pressed into it in terms of time or in terms of word count. And I think it's I have learned a lot about, a lot of times I don't know what I'm saying until someone says you have 500 words to say it, and then I realize what I have to say.
I think
That's my point.
And then there were 3.
Yeah, that's right.
I concur with that too. I mean, I the idea of what is public scholarship and this act of translation that you were talking about earlier today, Stephen, but the actual practice of that, which is not how I was trained at all in doctoral work, which was to be very obtuse and to aim for 5 people, a 5-person audience, right, and a lot of jargon and way too many words and way too many adverbs and but to translate that very concisely is something that benefits us as academics, those of us who are academics. I spent a year at the State Department on a fellowship during my sabbatical year. I came to Washington my sabbatical year. I didn't go to the beach I know it was, but I did. And I learned a lot, not so much that I think, the United States government's going to turn course anytime soon on Islamophobia, but I learned how to better communicate my ideas, because when you give a briefing in the State Department, you sometimes have 5 minutes, and you don't always get all that 5 minutes. That could cut you off any time. So you start with your main point, and then you kind of whittle down in terms of specifics if they're still invested. And that's sort of inverted the way I communicate. So there is something powerful about this communication and memes and the way we package this and the way we do this on Twitter with limited characters, to be sure. But I think it's helped me in terms of my own scholarship. I will say one more thing, though. I keep imagining right now, in terms of the world I live in with trying to challenge Islamophobia, the Bizarro conference that could be taking place simultaneously with the Islamophobia industry, who could be having the same conference in some ways, right? How you package your ideas and memes. I would argue they actually do it far better. I rarely compliment the Islamophobia industry, but when it comes to this, they do it far better than most of us who are academics do. They're well funded to do it. Robert Spencer, how many blog posts has he spit out today as we've been talking, right? He's paid to do this. He's paid a lot of money to do this. They're very savvy at the way they package in terms of digital marketing and messaging. Robert Spencer knows SEO. And if I say SEO in a gathering of academics, they don't even know what that means. That's kind of why we're in trouble, right? Robert Spencer knows if he wants to write an article about me or you, he knows how to write it in a way that's going to rank high on Google search engines. So this is shaping the knowledge one has of Mehdi when they Google him or me. And they know how to do this quite well. And how do we counter that? But my moral sort of debate is how do we counter it in a way that also, going back to my earlier point, is not just tit for tat. They just said this about Islam, and on a tweet, I'm going to respond with the truth about Islam, and that's how we deal with this. I'm still working through how can you use memes and tweets and that sort of thing to deconstruct the very premises of the knowledge that's out there, the pseudo-knowledge, I would call it, when it comes to Islam. And that, to me, in terms of what is the actual content of the meme, is much more difficult for me to get at than should we be doing this or not, or is there value to translating this into a very concise package sort of way, but what is it we're actually packaging?
I lost the thread of what I'm responding to, but it's still, I think, relevant. So when you fill out grant applications to funders, it's if my program is successful, the world will look different, X, right? And you have to kind of fill that out, paint this beautiful rosy picture. I think we should ask ourselves like a similar question: if we're not successful, if this collective enterprise is not successful, who will we fail? And I think because of the privileged space that we're in and we all reside in, we don't actually think about, what are the real life consequences for getting this wrong, that, suicide rates are up, that, young Muslims are getting bullied, that all of those follow-on effects mean that we have to meet people where they are. And frankly, it's a privileged status to say, we're just gonna keep doing what we're doing, and it's a failure of stewardship of what we know, and a response to how the world is changing for young people who don't know what their, jobs are going to be in 10, 20, 30 years. They'll have 8 or 9 jobs over the course of their lifetime. How do we fill that hole that people are feeling, which is why they're on social media? So I don't disagree that it's an opening to an aperture, but I think it's a little, obtuse to not consider the consequences and the urgency of those consequences if in fact we don't change to respond to the moment right now.
Scott, in my part of the world, this is called Bhagavat. It's called rebellion. We're rebelling.
I would just say a couple of things. Number one, one of the most popular Twitter accounts in the world is the Pope's. Yeah. So, and he's got it in 9 languages, including Latin. So if the Pope can do it, you guys can do it too. He also is really good at memes. You can't always prove that he's doing something for a photo opportunity, but let's face it, the idea of washing Muslim inmates' feet on Holy Thursday in his first Easter as Pope was designed to go around the world. His meeting with Muslim leaders around the world. This is a very media-savvy Pope. Communications office problems aside, they know what they're doing, and good memes can go around the world, as we've seen in evidence of him. Second thing, I think the train has sort of left the building here. Twitter is where it's at. If Martin Luther were around these days, the 17th thesis would be posted on Twitter. It would not be posted on church door, so you need to be there. That's what I say.
Yeah, no, Tariq will be happy to know that I many years ago, there was a book written called "The Medium is the Message." Jonathan, it was City University. So I agree that the medium becomes the message. So those of us who write books, it's kind of slow food, right? I mean, you have to go page after page and so on. But we're also living in an era of quick consumption, right? And pardon me? Acceleration, exactly. And information travels, and we become irrelevant very quickly if we miss that boat. So I'm agonizing between, the fact that we have to do this and how do we do. So I don't think it has to be an either or.
Yes.
It can be both, right? The second thing is, New York Times stories is way too long. Wash Post is the best length, right? I mean, the New York Times is a newspaper of record. I can't read the whole story. I browse through much of the stuff when I do that. An op-ed will grab me because it's like 700 words and so on. But the stories and the reporting is way too detailed. And so even though I'm kind of the slow food guy, I'm also getting tired by this very, very long news stories, and I really like the Wash Post.
But the most read piece recently on the Atlantic website page was George Conway's 10,000 word piece on Trump's mental health. It took me 45 minutes on a plane journey to read the piece. But people read it, and I don't know what the dwell time was on the piece, but they invested some time, 10,000 words. And you can either argue because it was a good piece or because Trump's nuts. So I'm not as disillusioned. Sometimes I am disillusioned about people's attention span. Sometimes I'm not. I guess it depends what day of the week it is. I think probably overall, definitely there is you guys know better than me as academics teaching young people, there's definitely shorter attention spans. I see that in my kids. But on the other hand, in terms of engaging with substance, as I say, thanks to Twitter and without wanting to sound like Daniel and Martin Luther, the new technology, yeah, you are able to access the knowledge that you guys produce and we produce and others produce in a way that you couldn't before. And therefore you do have bigger audiences. And I don't see why anyone, unless they're a kind of masochist, would not want to have a bigger audience for their work.
And, you know,
I would be surprised if you're serious.
Podcasts can be an hour long, right?
Oh, yeah, I
That's
mean-
an interesting counterexample, right?
Yeah.
People will listen to podcasts.
Hours long, yeah, several hours long.
Yeah, especially audiobooks also now is increasing a great deal. I didn't read the piece because I already knew the answer.
Keep the mic close to the recording. Sorry.
I said I didn't read the Atlantic piece on the mental health.
Well, you don't need a 10,000 word piece to know that Trump's nuts.
Yeah.
We saw a hand or two out here.
Oh my God, several times.
We should do several questions, not just one.
Maybe you should collect questions, Jim.
So, I have a lot of questions, but and I'm not an academic. My question is going to be grounded in some of the work that I do, especially in Pakistan and Afghanistan area. And it's about the religious piece, and I think, I'll just tell you what I'm finding that is leading, one factor that's leading to quite a bit of violence in some of the northern areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan border, is that many of the good sheikhs or muftis that I've talked to in India and Pakistan as well, from madrasa and all of that, they always said, why is public talking about, for example, these really intricate details of Shia-Sunni differences? It was supposed to be only for us ulmas to disagree and then eat chicken curry afterwards and go to each other's weddings, and then we can just disagree but also be happy, right? And now all of a sudden this information is out, and Lashkar-e-Jhangvi gets a hold of it and then start killing Shias, or Ahmadis become kafir, for example, and Ahmadis and Muslims, Deobandis and all of the Wahhabis and all of those were talking to each other in India for a very long time. Nobody declared each other. So there was a debate thing. As soon as this, maybe social media, I don't know, media piece and things of that sort, the cat is out, right? And everybody seemed to be able to access information that maybe the academics, theologists, and big sheikhs had this privilege and elitism that somehow they can disagree with each other and write all of these incredible things about each other, and that and they can digest it and not kill each other. But I find, and we did, I've done 17,000 leadership training, so we have done lots of pollings in Pakistan and Afghanistan and India of religious leaders. And we find a lot of times where there's incredible amount of anger, is where the general public cannot digest that these things have been said or written by academics or by very good theologians, and I point to you guys, but that they didn't know, first of all, or they never understood, and now through social media or some tweet, they said, did you know our sheikh said that about Shias? And so therefore, it's okay to, whatever, because now they are kafir, because my most beloved person who actually hung out with Shias all of his life actually declared them kafir 100 years ago. And that's what it says. And so for the first time, this information is out, and now they're all stupidly, violent around it. And I don't know, the Orthodox Jews, I've talked to many of the very Orthodox older Jewish rabbis who's like, there are some things we just want between us, and we don't want the public to know, right? And how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with this type of kind of a secretive disagreements between religious sects or religions that somehow theologians or academics feel that they are privy to and that they can digest, and then because you're no longer able to hold that information. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Maybe you should collect a few more questions over there.
Hi, on this topic of enhancing public discourse on faith and practice, women are more religious than men by every study, every metric. Yet, when you have media coverage of these stories, there's very little voices of women leadership, beyond clerics. Second, religion and violence, lots and lots of coverage of that. But peace is breaking out around the world, again, by any metric. You know, more people on the planet, more countries than ever before, fewer major armed conflicts. Where is the coverage of the religious interactions on peace? And third, this question of the nuns is really a very highly industrialized society question. If you look at the demographics internationally, 85% of people identify themselves as religious, and we're not looking at that within the context of all membership organizations are declining. The Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the sports leagues. People aren't going in-person places, so it's not something unique about religious actors that people aren't showing up in mosques, synagogues, and churches. It's about all face-to-face interactions. So how can we get some of those larger contexts in these media stories?
We've got one more. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I appreciated the move to the both and rather than the either or, because I think we could waste a lot of time trying to figure that one out. And so I had a question that relates back to the audiences being produced, and whether there is space to think both within media and then to do research on the side of academia, space to think about the cultivation of audiences and the building of capacity in audiences to hold multiple things as true, to be able to do nuance, to have an appreciation for also like what people are trying to do to solve the problem, which almost like never gets covered. And so whether there's space for that conversation to think about that, and then the attendant of that can there be more thought and research in terms of what civil society is doing to create spaces for in-person conversations. Admittedly, people aren't going there, but there also is other indications that people are very hungry for that. And so if it is a gateway, if there are other things opening up the conversation, what are the actual spaces where people can have that beyond the traditional ones?
Running a news organization, I'm constantly looking at technology and what's happening. So one of the things we did at Religion News Service last year is we applied for and went through the logistics for Amazon Echo or Amazon Alexa and Google Home Assistant. So if you have those tools, you can set up the question, what are today's religion news headlines? And so we produce that every morning. But as running an organization, I've got to figure out how to leverage technology to get to where the audiences are. So, you know, Twitter's here, it's going to be here. 5 years from now, there'll be new technology that we're not even aware of now that we'll have to figure out how to deploy. So, running a news organization, it's one thing to worry about 750 words of copy for a print product, op-ed, but we're trying to constantly layer in technology as technology emerges to be relevant. So I just want to, it's a struggle when you're running a news organization to keep up, and also how to make decisions where to deploy your budget as technology emerges. So that's a challenge in the business.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's coming next is virtual reality TV, where you see this already with some aid organizations where they give people the ability to step into a humanitarian camp and experience what goes on there 360 degrees. And people, I saw it at the Southern Baptist Convention actually. They were trying to increase their missionary aid to that part of the world, and they thought, oh, we'll give people a sense of what it's like in these situations. And it was actually really powerful, and people came out of it really moved. And I think you're gonna see Wolf Blitzer in your living room at some point, and it's just gonna change the, yeah, whether you want to or not. But that's the next huge thing I think. It's really expensive to do right now, but it's coming, and so that I think pushes against the speed and the lack of nuance and complexity and depth. If you could put people directly in the situation where, not directly in the situation, but in some sort of facsimile of it, it's going to be a tremendously powerful news tool. I think that's coming sooner than we think.
I was just going to quickly answer to Azhar's question. So I think nothing is private anymore, right? And all the material that is out there, what Sunni said about Shias and Catholics said about Protestants and Protestants said about Jews, all that material is out there. When you do your search, it's going to come up, right? So, because all these ancient materials are also now in digital form, so they show up in Google searches. And those who take the time to read it will be surprised. And so there will have to be narratives of why people said these things about each other. And the second thing I was going to suggest to your suggestion is that I think, I hope any of the deans yet pay attention to that, and that is that if you have if someone produces a 6,000 word article, right? Is there a possibility within the school that you work with a magazine editor that can boil this down into a 1,500 word piece that can go on, religious news services? Or if you have a book, and can you turn it into a 5,000 word story that is also accessible, and then maybe you can read it out yourself or get someone else to read it out into an Alexa or a audio essay, right? Those are the ways I think that we need to begin thinking about in getting our material out there. But it obviously takes some work and it requires some resources and so on.
Dissertation abstracts on Alexa, that would be very popular.
I disagree. I don't know how you're teaching your folks. But I insist that the material must be literate, must be readable. That kind of stuff that you were taught to write it as opaque as possible, that doesn't work with me. So you have to write, and we now teach students that you need to write the book, in fact, the dissertation that is almost publishable, right? So those days are over. So I don't know why you're complaining about dissertation abstract.
You're better. You're better.
No, I'm just with the time.
I just wanted to say, with response, I mean, I'm sure you were referring to a lot of other things, but some of the disputes that you brought up were highly, highly public when they happened, and the people who were targeted then. I mean, you mentioned the Ahmadis. It was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto who named them, and every Pakistani after that, in order to get identification, had to sign a document saying Ahmadis were not Muslims. So I mean, obviously there are many others I'm sure that you were referring to that were private, but that certainly was very, very public and extremely immediately injurious. As far as the question about audiences being produced, I mean, I know I sound extremely polemical and so on, and I did want to make, actually, Mahdi, the thing that you mentioned about Al Jazeera Plus, AJ Plus, I mean, that is a highly, but I would say highly exceptional, because I don't think what they do, I don't know if any of you have watched it, AJ Plus, they put out like 2.5 minute, very well produced pieces on some current event, big topic. And I mean, it's extraordinary. You watch 2.5 minutes and you think you've learned like centuries of history with breadth and depth and facts and so on. And it's extremely well produced, and people watch, young people, I don't know if you know anything about the audiences maybe, but from what we understand, they're very, it targets mostly young people. So that's a very good example. But I do think still, I mean, you mentioned, Zinat, the question of, isolation and increasing suicides and, this obsession with social media. I understand it's true that one has to be cognizant of and listen to the concerns of young people and the spaces that they occupy. My only hesitation, and at DN, we get audiences all the time from schools whom we speak to after the show, schools, colleges, different demographics, poor, rich. And it seems to me that first of all, that people want to know more that, is immediately apparent if one just looks on social media. And also that one can't resolve the problem by producing more of it. In other words, if you say someone is, and this is not exactly analogous, but if someone is addicted to cocaine, the solution to that addiction is not to give them more cocaine. So in that sense, I appreciate what you said too, that one can do both, but that one also always has to be attentive to the other. It's not, if you see.
I was just going to say, on the AJ Plus, though, it has inspired other people to follow, and there is more quality stuff coming out from different. Vox does very good videos. I'm sure CNN has a bunch of online. Don't even talk more about that. New York Times has started doing. A lot of people in the explainer space. I know, but talk about quality different, but the effort to try and
yeah, of course,
to
we do that too.
exactly, not just sensationalize. I'm talking about the intent behind it as well. Just to come back to the question about, you had that multi-pronged question about women and peace, etc. I mean, the women's side of things, I think it's hard to lay that at the door of the media in terms of religious discussions. I think faith communities have failed when it comes to females, both in terms of leadership and obviously scholarship, etc. And I think for the media to reflect, to even get journalistic organizations, Daniel talked about getting guests on CNN and recommending people, I think you would admit that it would be a struggle to find female leadership in those faith communities because the faith communities have failed, not because necessarily the media is ignoring women of faith. I would slightly push back against that, and that applies across the board in terms of even politics. If we're trying to get on my show, on my Al Jazeera show, big name, powerful people to hold to account, unfortunately they tend to be men because that's who are running governments and major organizations, not because we're trying to ignore women. In terms, and again, on the point you made about peace, the point you made about peace is interesting because the old adage in the media is if it bleeds, it leads. And unfortunately, we are as an industry obsessed with conflict and division and violence and war. That is also what rates, that is also what people tune into the news for, that is also what tends to be new often. And again, I don't think that's religion specific. I think that's a problem across the board in terms of covering quote unquote positive news versus negative news. I think that's just the reality. You talked about stories that repel. I think that would be one. People say, let's do a good news story about people getting along. I can imagine a lot of editors say, no thanks. And I think that is a problem. And yeah, obviously within religion, because, for example, in Islam, because Muslims feel demonized so often by the media, it's a very particular demand in Muslim communities. I get it when I speak to Muslim audiences. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Why isn't this covered? And I'm like, be realistic. I don't want to be kind of too cynical, but we have to be realistic. I'm a Shia Muslim. I get tomorrow's Arba'in, the 40th day after the killing of Imam Hussein. 26 million people roughly are in Iraq right now. It's one of the biggest gatherings of human beings on the planet. Every year I get Shia Muslims mentioning, how come the media's not covering this? How come it's not on CNN? How come nobody's covering this procession, this peaceful Muslim prayer? And I'm like, that's just unfortunately the way of the world. But I can promise you, God forbid, if something blows up tomorrow, yeah, it'll get covered. And that's, I don't think that's necessarily religion specific. Obviously, in the Islamic context, there is that. But I think there's certain realities.
Yeah, but what about when are you going to get the marginalized voices, the excluded voices? When are you going to get that voices onto your show? And you are the intercept, right? You're supposed to
I don't know what you mean. You have to be specific.
No, and for instance,
that's a very sweeping statement.
Well, that's what I intended to. So, but you say that you need powerful, impactful people and so on. So you're going to get all these powerful voices who are going to say the same damn thing over. No, they say the same thing.
But I wasn't speaking for myself.
No.
Do you know what I did before I came here today? I'm going to feel a little bit foolish when I tell you.
No, when you get people on your show.
Yeah, on my show this morning, I interviewed a 19-year-old indigenous activist from Colorado who's working on climate change.
But the example you gave.
That's a marginalized community talking about a big issue.
No, the example you gave, you said the media feels like.
I was talking generally across the media. Not everyone is as good as I am at my job in terms of pushing. I didn't know you wanted to talk about me specifically. I was talking about the industry as a whole, which perhaps doesn't pay as much attention.
That's what I'm saying about the industry.
Fine. If you're being in general, then I agree with you. I agree with you on the industry. But that's how you started. You said, when are you going to get people on this show? I'm just politely pushing back. Yes.
We have to wrap up. One or two more thoughts, please, and we have to wrap up. Yeah.
I just want to kind of address the issue of kind of gender and technology, because the internet is a double-edged sword. It was sold to us as, the internet is going to be the space where it's going to make an equal playing field. We are going to kind of have more diverse discourse, and it does, your minority voices get amplified. Gender, women that didn't have a space now have a new space to talk. But what we're finding research-wise is that, the biases that were in mainstream media have just been replicated online. Google Translate basically is biased on racial and gender barriers. A new study came out 2 days ago that just shows that, that women Twitter followers, even the top influencers, have, a significantly less following, than men online. And so what we see is just that as religious communities, when we look at these technologies, there's some issues that we need to address at an ethics kind of level, that we can't just use them out of the box because they're going to replicate the same social structures we have that religion is trying to change in society as a whole. And so I think it's a real level of complexity, and it's like, when we think about technology, that there needs to be kind of an activist response for religious groups in reforming the technology as well as using it for our own purposes.
I'm really enjoying this discussion.
You never joined the circle.
Actually, on that,
That's a marginalized voice.
No, actually, okay, let's stay with that then. My visceral response, actually, listening, I was really enjoying it, and then I became, hang on a sec, I'm outside the charmed circle here. They're having a really good chat, and I'm not part of this chat, and I thought, it's okay. I can create a meme and break into the circle. No, but it's interesting, isn't it? That gives me the illusion, doesn't it, that I can maybe break in and become part of the circle. But is that illusory?
No, you're outside.
Yeah, so I'm standing up. Now, if I stand up and I fall off the back of the thing, then you're... So we need a bit of drama, don't we? A bit of drama. But it's just, no, just to stay for... I'm just going back to the sensationalism, but I mean the dramatic meme in terms of, I think, how you articulate and express and embody, for example, religion as a driver towards peace. It's a fascinating one, and I think I'll push you a little bit, actually, on thinking about how journalistically you can cover stories that actually are celebrating aspects of religious actors involved in peace building. I know it's not necessarily spectacular, but it's interesting thinking about how you can drive that.
There definitely have, just quickly on that very idea, there definitely have been good news. There definitely have been good news stories. I remember in the UK, people do like the stories of, look at this community of Muslims and Jews not killing each other and saving a synagogue in Bradford, or whatever it is. The problem with those stories, of course, is that they're kind of one-offs, right? It's not systematic. We're talking about systemic coverage problems and institutionalized discrimination and quote-unquote demonization of minority communities. That's never going to be enough, just doing that in that kind of random ad hoc way, even though I'm totally pro that.
26 million people in Karbala. Does deserve a story? That's the biggest gathering of people. More people than on Hajj. Why can't that be a story? And these people, they don't kill each other. They celebrate.
You always have the Bethlehem story. You always have the Bethlehem story of Christmas.
All right, let's thank our panel, please.
Yes.